the second part of our responsive design. We're going to look at responsive layouts. So there's a lot we can do with responsive layouts, but there's not actually that much code that goes into it. So using CSS Grid and media queries really lets us do a lot of cool stuff without having to write too much new lines of CSS. So I'm going to start just doing a demo using the grid template areas, but I'll do a short overview of using the column start end method as well at the end. So if you're using the grid template areas, you can watch this part, and if you're not, you can skip to the next part. Let's open up responsive layouts and get started, and we're going to be doing some different stuff in here. So I have my project already opened. I'm still working in the responsive folder that we created in the previous video, and here's my index page. So we added the flexbox to make this menu up here, and everything else is pretty much the same. So what we're going to do is look at using media queries to make changes to the site to make it more responsive. So let's talk about what responsive design means, and then we'll look at ways to implement that. So we're going to be talking about responsive design first through the layout. Let's see if we can get a better color here. That looks good. So yeah, responsive design is the practice of designing websites that change style and layout to fit a variety of different devices, different dimensions, different screen densities, and different functionalities that are available on different platforms to create a different design or different experience depending on the user's platform. So there's different ways that we can think about this. There's a few terms to think about. Adaptive design is designs that change based on the screen size or density. So you have like a specific design that changes for mobile or for desktop. Whereas when we say responsive design, we're usually more talking about one design that moves to change with the environment. So an example of that would be if you have like a section like our text section right here, you'll see that as we move, that text section will actually get smaller just by moving, just by changing. We're not actually updating the design at all at this point, but the size of the content changes when we change the window size. The difference with adaptive design is when we go into like a completely different device. Like here we see the iPhone view in the mobile emulator. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but you can see it looks the same, and that actually is not really what you would want to see in the mobile view. So what we're going to have to do is apply adaptive design to just completely redo the layout for the mobile view. So those are the two basic concepts that we're going to be working with. Both of these concepts come out of the idea of progressive enhancement, which is kind of this is it's a big word for a pretty simple idea, which there's a good article on it right here, and you can kind of see this. I like this peanut M&M visualization to kind of show what this means. So the content is kind of the peanut M&M in the middle. The presentation is what we, the chocolate part, and then this client-side scripting is what kind of makes those things, enhances those things. So our content on our page may be like our text, the ability to create a post. That's the content that we're interacting with. The presentation is the things like the layout, the colors, typography, etc. And then the scripting, the shell that holds it all together, is our CSS and our JavaScript, which makes decisions based on what our platform is to change our content. So progressive enhancement is a way to think about starting with the content and then adding functionality on top of it. So always thinking about what works with the content that we're displaying, which for us at the moment is really just simple text-based posts. You guys are also going to add the ability to add images in your posts, so you can focus on that content as well. And then we have other components of our content, like the ability to add content here. And we also have our user information as well. So there's some more articles. where I got kind of most of the ideas from. So if you want to go into more detail, these are some good articles to go over some of these concepts. This responsive web design kind of shows a design that adapts to different sizes. So you see a wide view of this design with 3 pretty large images here. Then down here we see a smaller view where we group the images, even wider view where the images are all in a line. So we'll look at how to kind of do that. These articles will cover more detail on these concepts. Fluid versus elastic layout. This is one that is not quite as important these days. This is kind of something that you might have seen. Let's see, when was this article written? I don't see the date for the article, but it's probably about 10 years ago. This was kind of the basis for a lot of these 2-column or 3-column layouts that were popular. And still you see a lot of these on the web, but we have to deal with mobile devices now, which really changes the way that we think about design for the web. Adaptive versus responsive. So these are the 2 concepts that I described, and here's some good explanations. So here we see a responsive container. So the container just moves as we change the size. This container, you'll see, is going to change sizes entirely based on a few different breakpoints, which is what we'll be implementing with our media queries. And then another article on wireframing. This can be useful just to start doing some drawings or doing some quick mock-ups to start thinking about what you want something to look at. So all of those are just some resources for you guys to check out if you want a little more detail than what I cover. So we're going to start with CSS media queries, which is basically a way that we're going to be able to target different sizes for our design. So this is kind of our desktop design. That's sort of our default, but we'll also add designs for the mobile and for a tablet. So we're going to start just by setting a maximum width for our content. In this example, I have 960 pixels. I think in this site, I've actually already done this. You can see I have the max width at 800 pixels. And I think I made it a bit smaller just for the sake of demonstration because I usually have this elements tab open over here. So that kind of restricts what we can see on the site. I'm also usually on the classroom computers. I have a much lower resolution there. So we could implement the 960 pixels here and probably do okay. So let's give that a shot. And 960 was kind of a baseline width for a lot of sites for a long time. So we can start with that. That is in our main.css. We have our container here. So the main CSS file contains some basic styles for some kind of generic elements. So this is the asterisk is all the elements, the button in the input. This styles all of the buttons and inputs. So on our site, like these are the buttons, inputs, buttons here as well. Whoops, I did not mean to publish that. I need to actually clean out our database a bit because there's a lot of empty posts in there. I'm just going to delete that one. All right. So at some point I'll probably write a script to delete all of the empty posts. So moving on, so in our main style sheet, we also have some of the basics for our container. You might also put this in the layout. That might also be a good place to put this since we do have the container there. So maybe since we're talking about layout now, I'll do that. So I'm just going to move these rules over to layout.css. So I'll take my container and I'm going to say max width. And I'll talk about max width for a second. So I'm going to say 960 pixels here. And I'm just going to get rid of this rule. And I'm going to get the margin auto as well. I'll talk about that in a second. So these rules are actually some really nice defaults for a responsive site. So you can see when I refresh, I have a bit wider site now because I'm using 960 pixels. So let me show you what happens when I change this from max width to width. So with max width, I'm saying, you know, that's the maximum possible width, but that means that there can be smaller widths. So our site will adapt or respond to a smaller browser window. If I change that to width, that means the site is always going to be 960 pixels wide. And so if my window is too small for that, then you're not going to see any of the content that goes beyond the window. And you might also see a scroll bar down here where you'd have to scroll back and forth. This is not really a desirable way to lay out a site. I don't know about you, but whenever I see a scroll bar at the bottom of the site, I think it's kind of annoying. So there's a couple ways we can respond to this. The adaptive way, which we'll cover in a moment, is to change the page based on different layouts. The responsive way is just to add a simple rule in here to say max width. And so what that basically says is that it can go up to 960 pixels, but at that point it doesn't get any wider, but it can also be smaller. And we can set a minimum width as well. For example, we might want to say, if we don't want to go to this style where it's kind of scrunched in here, we might look at how big is that, which we can see in Chrome. If we select this, you can kind of see down here in the bottom, the width is 568. So maybe we would say something like min width is 600 pixels. And so that way it's not going to let the site get smaller once we get to 600. So even that is probably too small. So let's figure out where can I get before it starts to look like that. It's around 635. So maybe I'll do 640. Okay, so now I can say here's the max and here's the minimum. So that's a good way to do a responsive design. And usually, we use both responsive and adaptive techniques when we're creating a responsive layout. So we have the min width, max width. So then the margin 0 auto. We covered that rule a few weeks ago, but just to review, if I don't have that there, then my site is going to be just flush with the left side of the browser. That's actually not necessarily bad, but it's not typical of sites these days. So what margin 0 auto does is it applies an automatic margin to the right and the left. So it calculates the remaining space from the 960 pixels, and it divides those between the left and the right. And so that kind of centers our container within the browser window. So that's kind of how we get to the default layout that we've been using for most of the semester. So another rule that we are going to need to add is the viewport tag. And so what this is useful for is basically saying that we don't want our design to change based on the viewport. So one of the things that an HTML page will do is, let's say we were to load this on our phone, which you can do it on your phone if you want to test, but you would have to do that with the GitHub site. So what we're going to do instead is just use the Chrome emulator. So if you have your Chrome developer tools open over here, there's a little button right here that looks kind of like a phone next to a tablet or iPad. And so if I click on that, we open up the mobile emulator version of Chrome. And so we can make it kind of imitate different types of devices, which is really useful for developers to try different designs. And it even kind of makes a fake little touch, that circle, see how the mouse turns into a circle? That is imitating touch. So rather than scrolling on the site, I can actually pretend to be touching the site. And then you can see, like, here's the iPhone 5, here's the iPhone 6. It kind of changes the dimensions. And here's iPad and Galaxy. So it has a few different options. Obviously, there's a lot more phones than what you see on here, but there's a few different options so we can test different things. And then we can also go into responsive mode where we can actually just change the width and height just by using these drag elements over here. And then we can also create our own devices over here, so we can choose which devices we want to see. So if you have like a Galaxy whatever and you want to see it on here, you can choose one of those devices. So there's a lot of other settings that mobile emulation does, but we're just going to start, and I'm just going to choose the iPhone 5, which I think is the smallest iPhone that is still kind of being used regularly. Or the SE, that's actually what I have. So that's usually where I start, and then I'll move up from there since that's the smallest. So you can see that by default, our HTML page is actually zooming out to try to fit the content on the page. And that's nice so that we can see everything on the page. But that's kind of assuming that we're not going to change the design, which we are. So we want to, that's the first thing that we want to change is we basically want our website to say, you know what, leave whatever the default is. So all we have to do for that is just copy this line here and add that into our HTML pages. So on index.html, right after meta char set, we'll put that in there. And I'll just type it in. So this is meta, this is the viewport. So name equals viewport. The viewport is basically what the browser shows the viewer. And so it includes things like how big it is, how wide it is, what the pixel density is, things like that. And so the name of this meta tag is the viewport, and then the content is what we want to say. So the width is going to be the device width. So we're basically just saying whatever device is being used, just use that. And then we're also going to tell it not to scale. So we're going to put a comma and say initial scale equals 1. So it'll start off as just the basic scale. I'm going to close that off. And so you just have to copy that exactly the way it is into your code. And so I'm just going to make a copy of this and add it to each one of my HTML pages so I don't forget to do that later. So here's my create.html. And here's my profile.html. Okay, so now when we refresh the page, whoops, let's leave index.html. Now when we refresh this page, now we see we're no longer zoomed out. We see our site, but it still doesn't look exactly right because it's still trying to fit into this area. So we're going to make some changes so that it fits better. Okay, there we go. So I was able to fix that by just opening a new tab and displaying the site again. So I think it somehow cached the view. So by just closing that tab and opening a new one, I was able to get the right view. So now we can see the right pixel size in our site. So obviously our site content does not fit on the mobile screen. And so what we're going to do is use a media query to kind of reorient our layout and then change our design a little bit. So we'll get into that next. So for media queries, we need to do is choose breakpoints. This was a lot easier when we only had like a few different devices, but now we have tons of devices. So it's very difficult to make a breakpoint for every single device. You can find media queries for essentially every device if you want. So if I go here and I search every Apple media query, this will show me, you know, every CSS media query I would need for every single iPhone, iPad, from every generation. And it's kind of a lot. If you're not working on like a really important, you know, professional level site, I would probably say don't worry about this. Just choose a few breakpoints that you're comfortable with, and then, you know, make sure that they look okay on different devices. So make sure to test them. So testing is really very important. Here's media queries on CSS Tricks. You can see there's a ton of stuff here. So there's, you know, phones, tablets, laptops, and wearables. Even within phones, we have iPhones, Galaxy, Google, Windows. So there's just a lot of different stuff here. So for us, we're just going to stick with a couple basic ones just to go over how they work. But if you want to update your site for whichever device you use, you can change your what you're using for that. So let's start by adding some media queries. So I'm going to make a new style sheet. So I'm going to go to style.css. Our responsive design should actually go at the bottom of everything because it's going to kind of be applying, we're going to apply rules over the previous rules. So we want to make sure it's the last thing we import. So we'll say css / responsive.css. Sometimes I call this media queries. It doesn't really matter that much what you call it. So then I'm going to open a new file, save as, make sure I'm in responsive, go to CSS, and we'll call this responsive.css. Let's make up a media query for our mobile. And then we'll do the tablet next. So for mobile, it's a very different size. And so I'm going to use the iPhone. I'll use something a bit larger as a starting point just because most phones are actually quite bigger these days. So if I was working on a professional site, I would start here and then move upwards. But for the sake of time, I'm going to start with something a little bit bigger. I think the pixel, let's see. Yeah, those are both 411, 360. I'm trying to figure out. Okay, 414 is kind of the biggest phone on this list. So I'll go with that as a starting point. And so what I want to do is basically say everything under 414, apply these rules. And so I can use the media query max width to specify that. So I would say at media and then say max width is 414 pixels. And so what that would mean is that everything that's under 414 would take on any rules that I put inside here. And anything that's over that value, it'll ignore. One thing that I use more these days that is not in these notes is actually max device width. Because a lot of the new Apple devices and some other devices use retina screens with higher pixel density. And so you might see a difference between the width of the screen and the device width. So device width is actually probably going to be better in most cases. So I'm going to update these notes and I'm going to use max-device-width here. So let's just show that this works real quick. This is an easy way to do that. I'm just going to change the background color of the body. So I'm going to say background color is green. Okay, this is just a test to make sure that it's working. You might want to do this just to make sure your content looks right. So 414 green background, that's good. When I toggle the media query, now the background's back to white. So that shows me that it's working correctly. Now we have this problem where it's the wrong zoom. Okay, so that's frustrating, but let's see if I can just open another tab. Okay, so that looks better. I'm not exactly sure why I'm having that issue, but let's just keep going. So now we can verify that our media query works, and if we look over here, you can see that the body, we have at media and then this rule. And so that will only appear if this media query is matching the device that we see. So we're just going to stick with this media query for a bit. I'm going to delete this rule first. And then we're just going to start to edit our layout. So here's our layout. It has 2 columns by default, and that's the first thing that we're going to change. So with a mobile view, we really don't need 2 columns because people are used to seeing everything on the screen and they'll scroll a bit more. So that's the first thing I'm going to change. And if we change the grid columns, we'll also have to change the template areas. So we'll have to fit all of that into one template. And so I'm going to open up my layout and place that in a new tab here. And so here's our original grid template columns. And here's our grid template areas. And so the nice thing about a media query, I can put container here, and it will keep any of the rules that I don't overwrite. So if I leave this display grid here, I don't have to copy it over here. So anything I want to change, I just move over here. So I'm going to copy this and put it in the container. And we're just going to go to one column. So I'm just going to have one column. And since I don't need fractional units because it's just one column, I'm just going to say 100%. So we're going to have one column that takes up the entire page. And then we'll fix our grid template areas. So I'll say grid template areas. And we only have one column, so I can't use 2 columns. So I'm going to start, I guess I'll start with the title on the top. I think that's going to look better than the menu. Then I'll go with the menu. Then I'll go with publish, so we can see that right up at the top, and then I'll go with main. Okay, so really simple. We just rewrote our whole layout really quickly. Okay, so now we're going to have to also update our width of our site. We don't really need to deal with min width or max width because our device, we're only going to use one column. We only really have one width. So I'm going to change max width to 100%. So that should just fit the size of the browser. And then our min width is still 640 pixels. So that's why we see it's 640 pixels. So we need to unset that. So for the min width, we could say inherit, which will just kind of take on whatever value is before that from the body class. So we can look at what that actually translates to, which is 0 pixels. So that's good enough. We could also write 0 pixels, but I like inherit as just kind of a way of saying, you know, we understand what's happening here. So we've basically completely redone our layout very quickly just by updating a media query. And so we might want to change some other things like the size of these elements, maybe the font size, but I'll talk about that more in the typography lesson after this. Right now we're just going to focus on the layout. So one thing I might want to change is this flex box here. It actually doesn't look too bad, but you could imagine maybe if the username was really long or something like that, that this would take up a lot of space. So we can change our flex rules here as well. So I'm going to open up the menu.css. And again, if we leave these rules the same, they'll still work, but we can overwrite the ones we want. So I'm just going to take the user name here, and I'm going to make that take up the whole page, just so it gives it the space that it might need. So my username right here, I'm just going to say username, and I'm going to say flex basis is 100%. So that's our little trick to force this to take up its own space. And so now we see the username here and the edit profile and the logout down here. So we can also increase the font size if we want that to look a bit more natural. So I could say font size is 2EM. And I can also get rid of this margin on the edit profile because we don't really need that anymore. So here's this edit profile link. I'll just throw this right here. So we're just kind of cleaning up some basic rules here, and I'll just say margin left is 0. Okay, so we can also kind of change our flexbox rules around a bit. So now we still have our username, the edit profile, and the logout button here, and we can write a new post. And so that's pretty much all we need to do for this part of our layout. Let's take a look at our edit profile. That looks pretty decent, so we can come back here. And maybe we can log out and take a look at this. So this flexbox kind of gets broken in this layout, so let's fix that up. For our flexbox here, we have a lot of stuff. We have login email, login password, login button, and login message. And I kind of want to make sure, I kind of want to move these things around a little bit. So maybe we can actually use the order here. So let's put the create password at the end real quick. So I'm going to look for where that is. So create password. Oh, it's create link. Okay. So I'm going to add this as a rule. I'm going to say create link, and I'm just going to change the order. I'm going to say order, and I'm going to put it as 1. So it'll come after everything else. So that actually fixes a lot already. That's pretty good. So then the next thing I want to do is I want to get rid of that left auto margin on login email. We don't need that anymore. So I'm going to add login email. And I'll just make a little note here that I'm redoing the menu flex box. So here we're updating our layout, and here we're updating, I'll just say updating is better than redoing the menu flex box. So then our login email, we can say margin left is also 0. And since these rules are the same, I'll just combine them. So I'll just put a little comma here, and that moves that over, and that looks pretty decent. Okay, we can leave this the way it is. So now if we log in, then that looks pretty good. That's not bad. So we've kind of already redone our layout for mobile. So now we'll do the tablet view. I'm going to switch my emulator first. I'm going to go to iPad. And you can see the iPad, it immediately takes on the style of the desktop because it's bigger than the 414 that we set. And so you may be fine with that. But since it's on the iPad, we might want to make some changes. I actually think we could do something with this that will be a little bit better. So we can still use columns. We still have a bit of space. We also can consider that sometimes we see the iPad like this. So we may want to kind of design in between 1024 and 768 since we can go in between those two views. So let's set up our media query for the iPad. So we have mobile. So then next comes tablet. And again, there's a lot of different tablet sizes. We're just choosing one just for the sake of figuring it out. And then if you want to do other ones, you can. So for the iPad, I think what I want to do is actually kind of move things around a bit. So just to kind of show how much we can do with this. So for this one, I'm going to say at media. And so I'm going to treat everything above 414 as an iPad up to 1024. So for the iPad, we'll start with a minimum width. And I'm going to use min device width here. I'm going to say min device width. And so we'll start above the 414. So usually you just want to go up by 1 pixel. So we'll say 415 pixels. But then we also need to set a max width. So if we only set the min width, then it'll always be in iPad view. So for the max width, for the iPad, we can use 1024 as the kind of like larger width, or 768 as the smaller one. Let's start with 1024. So max device width is going to be 1024 pixels. 415 to 1024 is quite a large margin, so we might want to add something in between there. But we'll do this one, and then we'll look at how our desktop looks, and then we can add some more breakpoints if we need to. So let's start with our container. And for this one, the min width device doesn't really matter so much here for the tablet because we can't make it smaller. So I'm just going to say min width is inherit again. And then the max width I'll say is 100%. So with our devices, the user can't really control the width and height of their browser in the device. It's usually just set to be the whole screen. So we'll just leave the min and max width as inherit and 100%. So then we'll keep the rest of the rules. I'm actually going to keep the columns, at least for now. I might change those in a minute. Well, actually, I kind of want to, let's reverse the columns just as an example. So instead of having the 2 and then the 1, let's try 1 and then 2. And then I might actually do 3 because I might want to show how we can divide it into 3. But I'm just going to kind of move things around a little bit. So I'm going to start with one column on the left that's smaller and then a larger column on the right. And then let's just place our content. So again, we don't have to copy all the rules, just the ones that we want to change. So the grid template areas. So on the top, I'm actually going to put the title up on the top, which is a little unusual. We haven't had it up there before, but I'm going to put the title and then the menu. Let's take a look at how that looks. And then on the next line, we're just going to go straight to the main content with the publish section next to it. And then we're going to go main and then nothing under the publish for the last row. Okay, so we can see that by adding the title here, we're affecting our flexbox because we're changing the height here. So we're going to have to rewrite some of those rules. Other than that, I'm pretty happy with this. Although this, I don't know why this doesn't line up. Let's take a look. We have posts. Oh, I put this margin on the top of the post. It's probably a lot better to put it on the bottom. So I'm just going to open post real quick, flip this margin to the bottom. Okay, that's much better. Oh, you know what? Actually, I want to flip these. So I want to put publish over here under the title and the main content over here, and then nothing under publish and main right here. There you go. That's kind of what I was looking for. So now the problem now that I have is that the user info section or the menu section, that flex box is a little bit messed up. So we can rewrite the rules here. I'm just going to test it in Chrome and then I'll add it into the CSS. So we need to change the align items. The stretch isn't really going to work here. So we could try end. Oh, I guess I have an align self rule on this one. Yeah, I do. So I'm going to have to rewrite a lot of that stuff, but let's just start. So align items and let's just go through them. So start is up at the top. End is down at the bottom. Center is actually pretty good. And then I could fix this actually a lot by getting rid of this margin on the default H1. So let's do that. So I can do a default rule and just get rid of that immediately. Let's just say H1 margin is 0. Okay, that already looks a lot better. Then we just need to grab the user info. And this is also going to affect the login section, so I want to make sure to add that in there as well. So let's actually put these after the H1 since that's a default tag. So for our user info and login, I think I said align items was center. So that looks pretty good. And then let's just make sure, I think I might have actually said that was center, so that's not going to make a difference. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So now we have our post here, we have our content down here. So I'm pretty happy with that. So that's a decent layout for our iPad. If we flip this, that still looks pretty much the same. So that's not bad. So the last thing that I want to do here is I just want to go back to the desktop view and make sure I didn't kind of make anything weird there. And if I do need to fix some breakpoints, I can. So I'm going to turn off the mobile emulator. And so here's our regular desktop view, still looks normal. And then if we go down, okay, we still have basically our same layout. So that's combining adaptive design using media queries with responsive design using things like the max width 100% and the flex box. So I'm just going to close these guys out. We have one more section to talk about, which is the typography. So that is pretty short. So I'll just continue with that right now. If we go back to our notes, let's just make sure we covered everything. Okay, so the last bit is typography, and this is pretty simple. There's a few different things to look at here. So I'm just going to move this up a little bit. That looks kind of funny, but that's okay. So one thing that we want to keep in mind when we're designing for different layouts, so let's go back to our iPhone view. Okay, so here's our layout in the iPhone view. And you can see a couple things happening. One is that the text in some places is very small versus other places. And so we want to make sure that the typography kind of updates with the view. So these buttons look okay on a screen, but if that's your thumb or something like that, that's pretty small. So we want to make sure everything is visible. So we can use some responsive typography to update the typography of the site. So when you're thinking about typography, you want to kind of imagine what the site would look like in your phone if you're not actually using your phone, if you're just using the emulator. So with a big screen on your computer, that can be kind of difficult. One thing is you can just hold your phone kind of where you would normally read it, and then use that as a sort of measurement of distance, and then kind of compare what you see to what you see on the screen. So it looks a little strange, but essentially what you would do is, if this is your computer over here, and this is you, and this is your eyeball, and you're holding up your phone is usually a lot closer to where you're looking than the computer is. So you can kind of compare what you see on your phone to what you see on the screen, and use that as sort of a baseline. So there's not a perfect science, but I can tell that like this section is too small. This is very small. I can't really see that. This is small. This is actually pretty good. I don't think I need to change that at all. But mostly this UI stuff is kind of small. So we can make some simple changes, but then we can also make global changes. So one thing that we can change immediately is just change the font size, to something else completely. So let's open up our responsive design again. And so this is a typography issue, but you can see with our responsive design that we're actually addressing multiple components of our design, not just the layout. So we can put all this stuff in here. So if I want to change the font size altogether, I can just add a completely new font size for the body. So I could say font size, and I could say maybe I think it should be bigger. So I could go 20 pixels. Okay, so everything's a little bigger, and that actually looks pretty good. So I might kind of stick with that as a baseline. Another thing I might want to do is increase the line height, so that there's a little more space in between the text on the page. And you'll see that makes a big difference. If I do a line height of like 1.4, there's a lot of space there now. If I increase to like 2, now that's maybe too much space. 1 is kind of cramped. 1.5 might be a good place to start. 1.4 you'll see in a lot of places. 1.2 if you want a little more density on the page. I like 1.4 as kind of a baseline. So you can see this text is already bigger. My button's already bigger, which is nice. But I kind of want those to be even larger. And then I want to kind of balance out some of this stuff. So this H1 with the margins is actually kind of an issue in a lot of places. So I'm going to move this rule that I added to the tablet as a default rule on the main.css page. So any like default tags that I have on here, if I want that rule to go everywhere, I'll just put it in the main.css. Okay, so now we have this is a bit better, but we do want the H1 to kind of match the size of the device. But we'll look at a way to do that in a moment. So we've got our new font size and our new line height, and things are looking a bit better. I could also increase the font size for buttons here. So I could say button, another default element, and just say font size. And I could do pixels, or I could do something like 1.5 EM. It's probably going to be too big. I actually don't really mind that, but it's a little big. Let's try 1.25. Okay, that's good. They're nice and visible, and we can still see the content below the page. We could also change this input. Let's see if I say input here. How does that look? Okay, I actually like that. We can change the default sizes. We can also use fluid type. So this actually refers to how many characters we see in the line. So for some of our posts, they're pretty short, but here's an example of a post that's a little bit longer. Oops, I zoomed in by mistake. So I'm also just going to use my Wayne Gretzky quote as my kind of default line. So let's find that and copy that over. I guess I can't select. So I'm going to copy that. I'm just going to make a new post. So in our mobile view, in our regular view, this takes up 2 lines, which isn't too bad because it's about how long one line should be. But if it goes a little over, that's not bad for readability. However, in our mobile view, it takes up, whoa, it takes up 3 lines, and it's also kind of squishing our image there. So we can fix that. That's probably more lines than we want it to take up. It's not really bad, but it's a little bit worse than what we would ideally want. So for our post text, we can try to get that to fit on the screen. So when it comes to the amount of text we see on the screen, it really is the relationship between the text and the width of the space that it's in. So one thing that's happening here is we have a lot of padding. If I took that padding down a bit, we'd have a little bit more space for that content. We also have that big image, so we could make the image a little bit smaller in mobile view. So maybe if the image was down to 50 pixels for the width and height, that gives us a lot more room for our text. So then if we bring the font size down a little bit, so I'll say 0.5 EM, so that's too small, 0.75, still a bit too small, so let's bring it up to like 8. Okay, so that's starting to get close, maybe even a bit bigger, maybe 0.9. Okay, so it's still a little bit more than we want, but that's a decent size for the text. So let's go with that for now. The image, let's make sure it's centered. So let's say align self center. Although that looks a little bit silly in this context, so let's just leave the image where it is. And so now we're talking about our post text. So let's scroll. We're still in the mobile view, so let's scroll down under the menu and say updating typography. And so we have the dot post text. And so we're both going to change the padding. And the font size. So I think I said 0.9 EM. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And then we also want to change the image. Although you could leave the image the way it is. Maybe we could even take off the border radius. But that's what does... Yeah, we could actually take off the border radius and change the size. And that kind of looks nice. That might be a good design fix. You know, not necessary. And it's not always going to fit the whole text. So it might not always work. But so far this design is pretty good. So I'll just do that for now. If we run into an issue later, we can deal with that. So let's also add the, what's the class for this? Post profile image. Dot post profile image. So you guys who might also have images in your post will have to figure out a way to design that as well. So I'm just going to change the width to 50 pixels and the border radius to 0. Well, I don't want to waste a whole lot of time here, so I'm just going to leave this as it is for now. So the last thing that we can do with our typography is use viewport sizing. So this is a responsive approach. The previous examples where we just change the font to a completely new size, that's an adaptive approach that changes with different layouts. So this is a responsive approach that changes based on the size of our viewport. So this is a relatively new thing that we can use where VW stands for the viewport width and VH stands for the viewport height. And so we can actually set width and height dependent on the width and height of our browser. And so it's a little bit funky, but you can think of it as like 1 is being 1%. So if we have 1 viewport width and the width is 600 pixels, that would be 60 pixels, or 6 pixels. So we can try setting some rules to the title to make it fit in the viewport. So I'm going to do this in Chrome first, and then I'll go from there. So we have this H1 inside our title, and this should really actually be a link as well. So I know it is on the profile page. Yeah, let's make sure that's the same on every page. Obviously on the index page we don't really need a link to itself, but sometimes people expect that. And so let's make sure that's consistent across all of our pages. Okay, so now that has the underline, so that's good. So really we're dealing with this anchor tag here, but it's the title of the anchor tag. So if we change that font size to 1 view height, you can see it's very small. If we change it to 1 view width, it's still very small. So we can use a relative size here and then it'll update. So if I do something, if I find something that looks good, let's see, I just kind of want it to fit. So let's go with 15 VW. Okay, so if I change to a new device, you can see that the text matches whatever the height of that device is. Or sorry, the width. And let's try in responsive. Okay, so I refreshed. So let's say that again. Font size is 15 VW. That sounds like a lot, but anyway, you can see that the text is changing. So I wouldn't want this for my desktop view because it would look a little crazy. But for the mobile view, since we do have so many different mobile devices, this is a good way to approach it. So I can go back to my responsive.css and I'll say our title h1 and then the anchor tag inside the h1. The font size is 15 VW. Okay, that seems pretty good. So then if we update to a larger iPhone, that seems to work good. So that seems like a good baseline. And then of course, since this is in a media query, once we leave that view, then it just goes back to normal. So we don't have to deal with that anymore. So VW and VH is a nice fluid way to design the typography. So we'll leave that for now. So that gives you a bunch of different tools to update your site for the mobile and the tablet view. So I'm going to talk about the assignment for a second, and then I'm just going to do a quick demo with a different style of layout. Just getting started for anyone who's using a different type of layout. So I'm going to go back to the schedule. So the assignment for this week is pretty straightforward. Add responsive layout, so create responsive.css. Add 1 mobile and 1 tablet layout. So you can see how I have that set up here. I have the mobile here, and I have the tablet here. Okay, so I want you to play around with this. I don't want to see layouts that look exactly like my layout. I won't give credit for that. Even though it's not that many rules, there's still a lot of different variability. So I want you to try using these rules to see what you can come up with. Then add the menu.css flexbox, the create.css flexbox, and then some rules for the typography. So that's it for this assignment. If you have any questions, obviously you can ask me. I think it should be pretty straightforward, so you can get started, and if you get stuck with anything, we can review it. So that's the assignment. I'm gonna now just do a quick demo on doing responsive design with a different layout. So some of the layouts, I switched our layout to this grid template area style, but there's other types of layouts. So I'm just gonna make an extra layout and an extra responsive just for those of you guys who are using the numbers-based layout, just so you can see how I would get started. So I'm not gonna spend a ton of time on this, but I'll give an example. I'm gonna go back to my layout example and grab layout 1. Okay, so that's what my first layout looked like. And actually, I'll just copy the whole thing over. So I'm gonna go to the Finder, go to MMP 350, go to layout and grab layout 1. Save that, copy that, go to responsive, CSS, copy, paste layout 1. And then I'm just gonna make a copy, or actually I'll do this from scratch. So here's layout 1. Okay, and I'm just going to do this temporarily. So I'm going to go to index.html, or sorry, I'm going to go to style.css and change layout to layout-1. Okay, so here's layout 1, which uses our HTML and CSS rules. So okay, so here's layout 1. We have the two column layout with 2 fractional units and 1 fractional unit. And then all of our elements are placed using the grid column start and grid column end. So when it comes to doing responsive design, this one is a little bit trickier because you're going to have to figure out which columns to place things in instead of just using the names. So I'm going to make another example. I'm going to save this as responsive-1.css, and I'm not going to have this on the main page, but you can look at this in the class notes or on the GitHub, and you can also use the the sources to update this. So I'm going to save this as responsive1, and just like last time, I'm going to put the layout over here so I can see it. And I'm just going to make a mobile layout for this one. So I'm going to do @media again, and I'm going to say min device width, and I'm going to use the same 414 pixels for the larger iPhone. I'm going to start just by adding the max width and margin to the container. So I'm going to say max width, and I'm going to use the same 960 pixels. And then the margin is 0 auto. And I also did the min width is 640. So we want to make sure we're starting in basically the same kind of place. So we're going to start with just our mobile layout. And I'll use the iPhone, the larger iPhone again. So that's the 414. So I'll say @media, and we want to target the iPhone, so we'll say the max device width is 414 pixels. So anything under 414 we'll get this new layout. So we'll say container. So we have to unset the min width because we're under that 640. So the min width will just set to inherit. Just undo that. And then for the max width, we're just going to say 100%. So we're just going to fill up all the content in the width of the screen. And then we'll have to reset our columns. So we can't use 2 columns anymore, or we can, but we don't really want to use 2 columns anymore. So we're going to say grid template columns. And so we're just going to have 1 column. So it's going to be 100%. It's going to take up the entire screen. Entire width. Okay, so we still have a kind of broken thing because these guys, like the title, everything down here is still acting like there's 2 columns because we're saying grid column start 2. So it's starting over here and then going to column 3. So let's fix that. So we got to do those guys one at a time. So that's why this one takes a bit longer. With the grid template areas, we can just move the areas around. We don't actually have to change the rules. With this one, we have to be specific about where each section goes. So we'll start with the title. So the new grid column start, basically they're all going to be the same. The new grid column has to start here and at 1 and go to 2 because we really only have 1 column. So grid column start is 1. Grid column end is 2. And then we want it on the first row, so we can leave this rule the same. So any rule that stays the same, just leave it there. So grid 1 span 1 is fine. Okay, so now our title is up at the top where we want it, but it's overlapping with the rest of the content because we haven't rewritten those rules yet. So that's okay. If we see that, it looks a little weird, but we're going to fix it. So the user info and the login come next. And remember, those guys are basically in the same place all the time. So we can really just include those in the same rule. So for the grid column, we're just going to use the same thing as the last time because everything is going to have the same rules here. For this one, I'm just going to combine them. So the one way I can combine them is I can say starts at 1 / it ends at 2. Okay, so that's one way to write it. And then for the row, 2 span 1 is actually good. So that one we don't have to rewrite. Okay, so now we have our menu area, the user info, and the login. So that's pretty good. So let's continue. So the next section is our publish. We do want that to be where it is. So we're going to do publish post. And we really just need to do the same rule, but just as an example, I'm going to say grid column. And so now this one starts at 1, but the other way we can write this is with a span and then 1. So we're starting at column 1 and we're spanning one column. So we start here and we span across 1. So there's a few different ways to write it. You can say the start column, the end column. You can write out grid column start, grid column end, or you can say the start column and then how far it goes across. So we're spanning one column. So now we have our write post section, our publish post, and then finally our posts. And we also don't want to forget that we now have the profile section, which is one of our main sections. This one, we're going to have to change both the row and the column. So we're going to say grid column. Actually, the grid column rule for this one is fine. 1 span 1. So I don't have to rewrite that one. That one's good. We just have to rewrite the row. So we'll say grid row. And I guess we just have to count 1, 2, 3. So this one would be 4. And there we go. Not too bad. So it's a lot faster using the grid template areas, but it's still not so bad if we're using these column numbers for the start and end of each column. So I think that's pretty much everything. So this is basically just a quick overview of using the grid column template with the numbers. For the rest of using the flexbox and all of those other things, you're going to want to look at the rest of the examples for that. And so this is just a little example. I'm going to take this out of the main section, so I'm going to delete these -1s here. But if you are working with those things, you can go to sources and just add, the -1 here to the layout to change the layout, and you can add -1 here to change the responsive to see those. And then you can also just look at them on GitHub. So when I publish this to GitHub, actually let me do that first because it won't be there. So I'm going to go over to GitHub. I'm going to add all this stuff. So I'm going to say adds responsive design examples and click commit and push. Okay, so when I refresh the GitHub page, you'll see the responsive. And so for the CSS, so for layout and responsive, that's using the grid template areas. For layout 1 and responsive 1, that is using the grid template with the column start and column end. And so that's everything that I want to cover for this week. As usual, if you have any questions or you need help with anything, please reach out to me over email or Discord, and I'll include all the links to all this stuff in the YouTube video.